third video in my Basics of Colouring video series. Each of these lessons is meant to build on the ones before, so if you haven't already watched part 1 and 2, I highly recommend doing that beforehand, just to give you the basic grounding on where we are for today's lesson. Speaking of today's lesson, what we're going to be doing is talking about choosing colours for your images, about mixing and blending mediums, adding a little bit of shadow, and even working on some grounding. Now, over on the blog, I have several downloadable pages for each of these lessons, and the one we're going to be talking about today is this one, and it's all about colour. When we're little children, we simply use colours that appeal to us. So we end up with pink trees, purple dogs, blue suns, which is fine, and it's a good way to express yourself. But as we grow up, we learn that colour is also representational. So we can use that as paper crafters to our advantage. We can take an image and use colour to represent particular types of occasions. So looking at these gift stacks along the top here, I've used the same stamp in all 4 pictures, but just by changing the colour palette, I've been able to represent different occasions. So bright colours like this first one here are generally associated with fun, lively events or activities, making them great for birthdays. Red, green and yellow are traditional at Christmas time. We can even personalise the colours to a specific event or recipient, such as this colour scheme based on a wedding done in shades of blue and purple. Or you can use colour even to change the formality of an image. So even though this is sort of a fun and quirky image, if I use these more refined colours, it would be suitable for a wedding or an engagement, things like that. Colour you can also use artistically. It doesn't always have to be representational. So for example, the cakes along the bottom here, I've coloured them in artistic ways. So we've got a pastel here, just a monochromatic look, or even here this one is in the colours of Halloween. They don't have to be representational, they can be purely artistic. Many years ago when I was first learning how to paint, I would lay out every colour I had available to me on my palette. So different shades, different tones, end up with a fairly wild result at the end of the lesson. One day I had just laid out 3 or 4 colours on my palette when the teacher came over and said no more. She let me add a little bit of black and white, thank goodness, but I had to work just with what I had there on my palette. And that was the day where I learned not only about limiting the colours, but being careful with what you choose. So these days, those of you who've seen my work will know that I only tend to keep things to 2 or 3 colours, which I find gives a better overall result. Now again, that is totally up to you. Lots of people enjoy having lots of different colours and different tones and shades. That's a personal choice. I find that having a limited palette really helps to bring the end result together a bit more. So this first gift stack uses only pink, green and yellow. In addition, I've used lights and darks within each of those colours though to get the blends and variations that we've been talking about over the last couple of videos. Now there are times, of course, when I've used lots more colours to complete an image, but on the whole, I find that restricting the palette gives a more visually appealing result, particularly with smaller images. The other thing to consider when choosing your colours is what the rest of your project looks like. So for paper crafters, I generally advise selecting your palette based on any of the pattern papers or photos, embellishments, and other elements that you plan to use in your project. I have colour charts for my colouring mediums. These are the Copic markers and these are my Prismacolor pencils. I also have some for paints and things like that. You can just do a Google search for blank colour charts online and then fill them in with the mediums that you have so that you can see what the true colour is rather than print or even copy what you can see on the internet. I'm going to talk a little bit more about blending today. I did cover this briefly in lesson 1, but I want to show you in a little more detail how I actually blend, particularly when you're transitioning between 2 colours. I've just drawn a couple of strawberries. One is on the smooth cardstock, which I'm going to colour with pencils, and one is on the blending card, which I'm going to do with the alcohol markers. I just want to show you, again, as I said, a little bit more how I do blends. So with strawberries, I want to show you how it blends from the green of a newly growing strawberry into the red ripeness. So we'll start first of all with the pencil. As I said, I've drawn it on just to the smooth cardstock and I've already selected my colours. When you're using the pencils, you will remember that the light touch will give you a light color or a light coating of the pigment, which is what we want. So the top of the strawberry around where the leaves grow is going to be the darker green. And as I come down the strawberry, following the shape as we discussed, I'm going to start lifting my pencil so that the color is a lot lighter. As I come down the strawberry towards the point, I'm going to start reducing the amount of pressure that I'm placing on the pencil, which means less pigment. All right, and I'm going to pick up my next green, which is a lighter green. This is a 1089 for anyone that's interested in the colors. And I'm going to start by blending over the top of that darker green, placing a little bit more pressure, and again feathering off or reducing the pressure as I come down the strawberry. So this end down here is going to be red, and this end up here, the growth end, is going to be green. But I still want that transition. I don't want a sharp line between the green and the red, or else it just won't look right. It won't look like a proper strawberry. So in between the green, this light green, and the red, there's going to be an area that's kind of whitish, but I like to add in just a hint of yellow before I transition into my reds. So I'm applying just a little bit of yellow, very light on the pressure, and again I'm holding my pencil right back at the very end, and that allows me just to add a really feather light touch on that pencil, so you can barely see it, but it will help with the transitioning between the two colors, the lights and the darks. So I'm coming a long way down my strawberry, almost to the halfway point with that yellow, and that's because I don't want any obvious change. I want them to blend. Now if you notice that you've got an obvious transition, you can come back in with the other colors and add a little bit more if you need to. Now I'm switching to my lighter of the two reds, and again I'm holding it right back. This is a pencil extender. I'm holding it right back at the end of the pencil, and I'm starting to color sort of halfway, so that I know that I'm going to be a little bit heavier than I want to be when I first start, but then I'm going to work back up toward the green, and I'm going to lighten that pressure as I come along. So you can barely see it by the time I get back up into that green zone. So just by releasing that pressure, barely touching the paper. And that's why I was talking about in that first video about practicing those exercises with your pencils and your markers so that you can get that transition. So it's getting to know your tools. Alright, so there's just the very lightest of touches. And then as I come down the strawberry, we're going to get a little bit darker. Don't do it all of a sudden though. You still want that transition to the darker color. Okay, so I'll color in all the way to the end. And what I'm going to do with this lighter of the two reds is just still add another layer over the top. Even though I've done a layer, I'm going to darken it. Now always apply the light layer first, because you can come back in and add some more. So think layer on layer on layer. That's how you'll always achieve your best results when colouring with whatever you're colouring. Always by layering those colours. So soft as we come up to the transition. And then we're going to add in our final red, which is the darker one. Again, you can see I'm starting right down at the base of the strawberry. This will be where this red is the most intense. And then we work back up toward the lighter red and the green. And we're achieving those nice transitions. There's no straight line between any of the two colors. There's no obvious sudden change. Now, if you were coloring this in all the way, you'd apply all your shadows. So you'd shade in under these seeds, because the seeds of a strawberry are sort of indents. So you'd colour in your strawberry seeds, give them a little bit of shade or shadow, and that goes again to that push and the pull of colour. So by adding a darker area around the seed, that gives the impression that the seed is lower down than the rest of the strawberry. All right, so that's the transition. That's all about transitioning between those two colors. Let's do the same now on the blending card. So I've got my scrap piece of paper behind, and again I've got all my colors chosen. I'm going to do the same thing with the strawberry and with the alcohol markers. So starting with the green, I have a few more markers than I do pencils because you need a bit more variation in color. But there's still only green, a little bit of sort of a peachy color, and then into our reds. Oops, keep opening the wrong end. Okay, so we're doing those little flicking strokes that we talked about earlier. And that's going to help us blend those colors nicely and also give us the shape that we want for our strawberry. And it's up to you how much of the strawberry you make green and how much you make red. You don't have to add the green at all, of course, to the top of the strawberry. If you want it to be totally ripe, that's fine too, but this is just a lesson about blending those colors. All right, so this is a G40. The other two were a G12 and a G20. Okay, so we're just flicking those markers. You can see there's a sort of a fuzzy edge there. We're flicking that marker, and then we're going to come in with a YR000, which is a sort of a light yellow red, and we're going to work right over that green. Remember, we're using blending card and alcohol markers, so they're all designed to blend together. Now, this is such a light color. I'm going to finish the entire strawberry with this color. I'm following the shape of the strawberry. And then flicking back up into that green. Now, if you feel that you've lost some of that green, again, you can bring it back in, go the other way. So starting with the lightest of the greens, this is the G40. All I'm doing is flicking that color back in. Straight over that YR000. And then go up to the G20. So just keep adding the layers until you're happy with what you've got. Remember to let it dry and settle in place. Don't overwork it, or you'll end up with holes in your work. Now, I'm going to switch down to my darkest red. As people know, if you've listened to the last couple of videos, I like to put in my darkest colors first and then work up to the lights. So again, those flicking strokes, that's going to give us texture, and we're going to keep that color to the edges of our strawberry to give the shape. See how that's sort of forming an arc here? I sort of formed an arc there with the green, and we're going to work back upwards towards that green. Again with the flicking strokes all the way over the darker red. Keep working until you're happy with how those colors blend together. And then we're on to our R24. And again, if you wanted to add all your shadows and things like that, you can do that either as you're colouring or after you finish the reds, that sort of thing. Alright, so we're on to YR82. This is going to bring us back up into those peachy colours. We're just going to go over the top. Now, if you find, let me just show you here, if you find that you've taken a step too far, so between my red and my peach, or between the, what was it, the R24 and the YR82, you can see there's a very obvious color change. Now, you don't want to find that on a strawberry that you're going to eat, because you wouldn't eat it, quite frankly. So the way that you fix that is don't keep overworking that area there. What you need to find is a color between, or two colors between those. So grab out your chart, and we've got the YR82. These are why these are handy as well, so that you can go back in and have a look at what you're doing. So the YR82 is this peach color, and we use the R24, which is this red. So we need something that's between them, which would be sort of an orangey or a light red, so an R05. So an R05 is a lighter red. So we're going to continue bringing that up. And that's into our more orangey colours. And then we might use a YR09. And you can keep doing this until you're happy with that blend. Now remember, the colours are designed to blend together and work together. Okay, back to that YR82. Work your way up. Back into the greens. I need a YR02 just to finish that transition. Perfect. And then back into the greens. Now you can do this over and over again until the blend is nice and smooth, until you're happy with your blend, because they're designed to be that way. Just remember to give it a little bit of time to settle and to dry before overworking it. You don't want to overwork them. And again, we can come in with our darks around those seeds. And that will help to push them back into the surface. That push and that pull of colour. And to finish off the strawberries, this is just a little aside. It is about blends, but bringing in a white pen, the contrast is so great that it looks like really high shine on your strawberry. And if you look at a strawberry in the shops or under a light, they sort of, the high points of a strawberry are around those seeds. So that's how you get to how you'd finish off the strawberry if you were colouring the whole thing. You'd add a lot more darkness, a lot of shadows and things like that, but that's the basic gist of it. So that's all you're blending. Blending is also useful when you want to achieve a no-line colouring look, which is a very popular technique at the moment. One way to do that is to print your digital stamps or stamp your traditional stamps with very light coloured ink, so that when you add your darker colours over the top, those lines virtually disappear. Generally speaking, when we're colouring, we use mediums from two different colour families. So you might stamp with a solvent-based ink pad and then colour with your water-based inks. That's so the lines don't smudge. However, if you're going for this no-line colouring look, you really want that lined look to blend in with the colours that you add over the top. So let me just show you what I mean by that. So staying with the theme of the strawberries, I've just drawn a couple here. One was drawn with a Sharpie permanent marker, which is an oil-based marker. And the other I've just drawn with watercolour pencil. So I just want to show you the blending, how we can make those lines disappear. If we have the permanent lines, which is what we talked about before, and we add our colour, our watercolour. So I'm just doing a really bit of a rough watercolour here, adding in a couple of colours to the leaves. At the end, we're still going to be left with those lines. Those lines are going to stay because we've done them in a different sort of colour family with the permanent, the solvent-based markers, and now we're using a water-based colouring medium. So we're going to be stuck with those lines, which in some cases is what you want, which is absolutely fine. But as I was saying before, if you wanted to get rid of those lines, one of the ways to do that is by using the same colouring family for both. So if we had stamped with the water-based ink, or in my case drawn with the water-based ink, and then we come in with our water-based colours, I could just as easily use distress markers or watercolour paints, whatever. Doesn't matter what it is. What we're going to see is that those lines that we drew disappear into the picture because they're the same family. So they're also going to react in the same way. So if we just apply that water, they're going to just blend away. And that would happen if I were using alcohol markers or solvent markers and then colouring in with the same solvents, because they're all in the same colour family. My water brush doesn't want to give up its water today. So this is what gives that lovely no-line colouring look. See if we get another water brush. Okay, that's a bit better. And those lines are going to be just blended away. Now I can also apply that direct to paper method, so I can pick up the colour as I showed you in the first lesson. I can just pick up that colour. It doesn't matter that I've drawn these in red because it's watercolour. Those colours are going to mix and match anyway because I've already touched here. What you're going to find is that green is going to follow the water and travel into the bottom of the strawberry, or the strawberry itself. So see it there, it started to go into the strawberry itself now, which is fine. It doesn't matter with the watercolors. Sometimes that's the beauty of watercolors, when those colors mix and match anyway. So if you use your dirty brush just to continue on with your painting. But there you go. You can see how the lines disappear when they're the same color family, and when they stay if you're using two different color families. So far we've only mixed our mediums to prevent smudging or to get a no-line colouring look. Let's take this a little bit further and mix our mediums to create a bit more depth and interest in what we're colouring. You might remember this large flower I started colouring during the last lesson. I finished colouring it with the Copic markers using the same method, remembering to follow the shape of the image, thinking about movement and texture and the push and the pull of colour. So it's all dark where it goes into the centre of that flower and lighter on the outsides. Now we're going to take the image just a little bit further by applying a different colouring medium over the top. In this case, pencils, which we know sit on the surface of our paper. Now I'm not looking to recolour the image, just to sharpen the details and add a little bit more depth. Using a different medium means that I'm not going to disturb the colouring that I've already done, so I won't lose any of that texture or blending that I did yesterday. So I have a really dark purple and a black that I'm going to use to deepen my shadows, and I have a pink here that's going to add some highlights and bring out some of some of the areas that are closer to the viewer. So I'm going to start with that pink, and again I'm going to apply just a little bit, so a soft touch, just to part of the petal. So it's not all the way at the end. It's about 3/4 of the way, I suppose, along that petal. I'm going to add it a little bit darker, so that means a little bit more pressure at some points, but I'm going to feather it out. So again, I'm not leaving that sharp line anywhere. Not on all of the petals either. I'm going to choose the ones that are sort of up front a little bit more, and again that goes back to trying to trick the eye into thinking it's seeing depth. So pick the petals that are furthermost up in the image, which in my case are these obvious ones sort of around the edge. You wouldn't add any highlights to these little back parts here, and we're just going to add some highlights with the pink. You could use white if you wanted to. Be a bit careful with the white because it tends to be a little bit stark. Actually, let me show you. So if I added white, you can see here that's a nice, you almost can't see it, but it is there. If I was to bring in white, particularly on the darker colors, even when I'm using it very softly, it's really it's dark. It's a beautiful color, but you have to take care with white. So there are not many highlights in nature that are bright white, mostly things like water or polished metal, things like that. So you can see how it's a lot more obvious than the pink. So I tend not to use white too much for highlights unless I'm using it for metal or glass or reflections of water, things like that. So just a little bit of the pink. I'm going around each of those petals. So you can see how that kind of lifts them up. Where those white patches are, those petals appear to be a little bit more forward, a little higher standing than the ones that are at the back. And again, I know I keep repeating it, but that's that push and the pull of colour. Now, we're going to show you how the darker colours are going to push away. I'll start with the dark purple, which is actually dark purple, PC931. And I'm going to use it, I'll just use it on one side of the image so that you can compare the difference. So I'm going to start over here. I'm applying it quite heavily right in here at the very center of the flower, but then as I work outward, I'm releasing that pressure again so that it's not quite so dark. But I'm going to bring in some black and make it very dark. And again, black is another color that you need to be careful with because it can be quite overpowering. Some artists don't like to use black in their coloring for whatever reason. I do. I like black. I think it really gives a beautiful depth to the coloring, but you do need to be sparing with it. Okay, so we'll just color these few areas here so that you can see the difference and how deepening those shadows or the receding places is what's going to create that contrast. And that's what we're looking for in our coloring, and depth as well. So it gives that impression that these dark shadowy places are much further into the flower. And that's just by adding that little bit of shadow into those areas. So if you went all the way around, kept working, your flower would take on a much more three-dimensional look just by adding those darker tones and those lighter tones, so that push and the pull of color. In the last video, I talked a lot about the push and pull of color, which is using light and dark to help shape an image. Basically, light colors pull forward when dark colors recede, and that tricks the brain into thinking that it's seeing depth. Now that's different to shadows. I don't want to get too technical because there's a lot to learn about painting and shading and shadows and things like that. There's cast light and all that sort of thing. But I'll give you some of the basics and also do a little demonstration to help to show you what I mean. Shadows are generally muted colors, not usually solid black or solid gray, but more a tone version of the color that they land on. So whatever the color the background is. Now, if you want to add shadows to your image, then you do need to consider the light source. And to keep things simple, what we'll do is just consider a single light source for the purposes of this lesson. So we're going to go back to this flower again now, and I'm just going to show you what I mean about those shadows. We do need to look at light and directionality. So I'm going to imagine that my light source is up here and it's coming down across the flower this way. So any shadows will be cast in that direction. So for example, this petal here, the light's going to hit the top of this petal, and that means the shadow is going to be cast over this side. So I might actually use the purple. This is the PC931, and what it will do is the shadow will be cast in the same shape as whatever is above it. So in this case, it's this petal here. So I'm just going to basically trace the same shape, and it does have a hard edge because it's a shadow. Not a completely hard edge. We can make it a little bit soft, but it will have a harder edge than if you were blending. So where we've been doing all this blending here in the deeper, darker sections, this is a little bit different in that it's shaped to be whatever object is on top. So that's what's blocking the light. Now this next petal here, the light's coming this way, so it's going to be affecting these petals underneath it. If you wanted to take it a little bit further, what happens is that the further away from an object the other object is, the larger the shadow. So this under here would be an even larger shadow. I know that's a bit difficult to understand, but that's how shadows work. So this one here would have a shadow cast below it. This petal here would have a shadow on this one. And remember, they follow the shape of whatever is blocking the light. And you'd work your way around just like that. So you could keep going and doing all the different petals if you wanted to get that feeling that those are casting a shadow. The last topic I'd like to cover today is grounding, which has some similarities to shadows. You might have heard or seen in blog posts people talking about grounding their images when they're colouring. This basically means creating a relationship between the image and the area in which it exists. So kind of giving it somewhere to live. Now, to our brains, an object that has an effect on its surroundings must have mass and dimension. So that's another way to lift your image up off the page. Although this sounds a little bit technical, I think you'll understand a little bit better when I say that people do this a lot by adding a background, so giving your image a place to exist in the world. The simplest way to do this is to add a grey line around the entire coloured image, and that creates that relationship between the image and the space where it exists. Now, the way you ground your image can tell you a lot about the surroundings. It can tell you a lot about the shape of the image, where it is in physical space and its orientation. So let's have a quick demonstration about that. I've stamped the same image 3 times here, and I have a selection of grey markers from a C4 down to a C1, and I'm just going to show you different ways that you can ground each of these images. Think of each image as having 4 sides. So you've got a top, a bottom, and a left and a right. What I do when I'm trying to ground an image is just decide on the 2 sides that I want to add a shadow to, basically. In my case, I generally do the bottom and the right hand side. So what that means is that I'm going to take my C4 marker and I'm going to apply a line beside the image, outside of the image, anywhere on the bottom and the right hand side. So if we take this fin here, for example, this is the bottom and there's a right hand side here. I wouldn't go up this way because that's the left hand side and I don't want my shadow there. But I do from about here, this is going to be the right hand side. I'm going to bring that grey marker all the way down on the bottom, underneath this face. I don't want to come up here because that's the left hand side, but I do want to go down here, the right and the bottom, part of his tail, and up that right hand side. So just go around the image, marking in that line anywhere where it's the bottom and the right hand side in my case, and whatever side that you like to do, until you've completed the whole thing. And then we're going to use the C3, and all we're going to do now with these other markers is to soften that shadow. So we're just going to go over it and let the lighter marker come just a tiny bit further than the darker one, and that's going to soften the edge of our shadow. You can see I'm staying to the same areas, going straight over that C4, and just softening those areas. All right, and then we pick up, once you've done it with the C3, you pick up the C2 and do the same thing all the way down to the C1. Now what we've done in effect is create that relationship between the fish and its background. So now it looks as though it's standing up off the background simply because we've applied that little bit of grounding work, that little bit of shadow. So what you're looking at is a fish up against a surface. So he might be swimming along in front of a rock or a wall or something. He's casting that shadow behind him. So the other way to ground the image is to just apply the shadowy areas where the item or the image touches the ground. So in that case, again, we'll start with the C4. Wherever he touches the ground, so it would be here under his chin, under his fin, and you can imagine the fish being more like an ornament. So it's not a real fish. It's touching the ground in these places. So it's kind of standing up on the surface of a desk. And what we're doing is creating a relationship between the fish and the desk that it's sitting on. The fish, in this case, the fish ornament, and the surface that it's sitting on. So we're still going through those different colors. I'm still using the different shades of gray to soften those colors. So now what's happening is the light is being blocked from above, so this way, and that's what's making the relationship between the fish and the ground, just by adding these shadowy areas underneath the fish. It tells us that the fish is standing up on top of the ground. This one tells us the fish is up against the wall, and this one tells us that the fish is standing on top of the ground, or is resting on top of the surface of whatever. Okay, so you can see the difference. They both have a relationship with their surroundings, but in a different way. Now, if we wanted to make the fish look as though he's swimming in the pool, what we can do is, this is a little bit trickier. We want to create a distance between the fish and the shadow that he's casting. So it's similar to this, except that we want the fish to be a little bit higher than the shadow. If there was water between him and the ground, what you need to do is, I'm using the lightest grey here, is just approximate the shape of the fish. So kind of what it would look like if it was looking into a mirror. It doesn't have to be perfect. Shadows can be distorted and things like that. So don't worry about making a perfect fish shape. Just get the general idea. So he's got this long tail, lots of fins and things. So just sort of give an idea that it's the shape of the fish. So he's coming close here. This is where his head's almost touching the surface of the pond, or the bottom of the pond. And then his back arches up here. He's got a little bit of a fin, and it curves around here to the tail. And then you can darken those areas. So it would be darkest in the center of that shadow. So I'm going to come back in with my darkest of the greys, my C4. Now that I've described the shape with the lighter color, it's a lot easier. And then soften the shadow with the other colors. And again, this is how we ground this image, but just in another way. So to give more information about the fish and where he is in the world. In this case, he's swimming in the pond, and his shadow is being cast down onto the pebbly ground or the sandy bottom, or whatever it is you want him to be in. This would be the same as a bird. So if you had a bird flying overhead, you'd want their shadow to be cast down onto the ground. All right, so this is him floating in space. You often hear people talking about if you don't ground the image, then it's left to be floating in space. And this is actually what we're achieving by making his shadow be distant from him. We're making him float along in space. So as that dries, I'll just grab a blender pen. This is a 0. As that dries, that'll become a little bit smoother. You can see these are becoming smoother as they dry. But we can also see the difference in the relationship. And that's what I meant before when I was talking about how the way that you ground an image gives information about the background and the place that that image is occupying in space. That concludes our lesson for today. I hope you've picked up a few little tips along the way. Lesson 4, our final lesson in this series, will be a project. If you haven't already downloaded the little fairy wren from the resources page, do head over and print that out ready for our lesson. You can also find a colouring guide with the colours that I'm going to use if you want to colour along at the same time as me. Now, of course, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to send me an email as always, or head over to my blog or Facebook page where you can generally find me. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you for lesson number 4.